assemble them in maybe just in the doorway there. Don't come back to your seats.
Oh no?
No, we're just going to do the majority direction.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
If
I can just hold the jury at the door, please.
Back to your seat, please.
Yes. Members of the jury, do you have a form?
It's just coming through. No, it's just coming through. If the foreman would like to come forward.
Thank you.
Yes, members of the jury, have you appointed a foreman?
Yes, we have.
Can I put this question to the foreman of the jury, please? Just answer yes or no. Have you reached a verdict upon which you are all agreed?
No.
Thank you. Then if you just wait for one moment, you'll receive a further instruction from the learned judge.
Well, in those circumstances, you having been out for now more than well over 2 hours, I can accept from you a verdict which is that of a majority.
Yes.
In other words, a verdict of 10 to 2.
We have a majority of that nature, yes.
Well, normally I'd have to send you out to discuss it again, but we'll foreshorten that. What is the verdict by a majority?
10 to 2.
Well, no, but will you ask?
So have you reached a verdict upon which a majority of 10 to 2 are agreed?
Yes, 10 not guilty.
And you find the defendant?
Not guilty.
Not guilty.
Interesting. I just think it's interesting. If you were doing the right procedures, we'd ask you, have you reached a verdict upon which at least 10 of you are agreed? You would say yes. What is that verdict? Not guilty. Then you do not ask the next question, 10-2. If you say guilty, then the next question is, by what majority do you find? So it's quite interesting. If you're found not guilty by a majority, no one actually knows.
Right.
Except for you have a grave suspicion, because the jury's been out for hours.
But in any event, it's come a bit late for my client.
We've recorded that verdict in 25 minutes, so 3 minutes quicker than the original. Can we just show our thanks to the jury and ask them to sit? Let's go back to your seats, and then I'll explain, because the jury were out when I explain what's going to happen next. So I'll just ask the jurors to return to their seats. While you're returning to your seats, I'll, for the benefit of the jury, say that we're going to ask the learned judge to tell us what sentence he would have passed had the verdict been guilty today. We know, don't we, that in 1910 the verdict, of course, was capital punishment. We know that that no longer exists. So I pass back to Sir Anthony. We're just going to imagine, for the sake of this argument, that the verdict had been guilty, and I'll let Sir Anthony deal with it as a sentencing exercise.
Well, the punishment has to be life imprisonment, but the judge must then go on, as I was explaining in the absence of the jurors, to decide what is the minimum term to reflect punishment and deterrence, which the Dr Crippen would have to serve before he would become eligible for parole. That's not to mean he would get parole, but he couldn't even apply for parole until he has done that minimum term. The minimum terms were significantly increased in 2003 in the Criminal Justice Act of that year, put through by David Blunkett. And the answer is to be found largely in a schedule, which, as far as adults are concerned, let's leave children apart, adults is concerned, there are really either a whole life sentence. That means you are never released, like Myra Hindley, Bamber at the moment, Duffy, who I mentioned earlier, Nielsen and others. They will never be released. Then there is the next one where you start at 30 years, minimum term of 30 years, equivalent to a 60-year sentence. From that 30 years, the judge can either go up or go down, but its starting point for the judge will be 30 years. And the next starting point for the judge is in knife, we're not dealing with knives, that will be 25 years, and below that would be 15 years. I don't think this could ever be a whole life tariff case. That's essentially for serial murderers, and that wouldn't be this category. And therefore, you would be looking to see what your starting point is either going to be 30 or 18. If it's 18, you can still go way up again, but it's where you're starting from. And interesting enough, when we heard in the absence of the jury that when the Lord Chief Justice sentenced Crippen, he said that he had committed the murder for gain. If you remember, we were told that there was some money which she wanted to withdraw, and by killing her, he prevented that from happening. And if that's the case, then a murder done for gain starts at 30 years. That is the starting point from which you would make some adjustments. If, on the other hand, you decided it wasn't, the judge decided, it's the judge who decides, it's not the jury, that it wasn't for gain, then you would drop down to 15 years. But there are aggravating features which would take it back up again. One of them is a significant degree of planning or premeditation, and secondly, concealment, destruction, or dismemberment of the body. My guess is, in today's climate, the figure of somewhere like 25 years. I don't know whether you would agree with that. About 20, it would be 25 or higher. It wouldn't be lower than 25. So that's a minimum term of 25 years, equivalent in ordinary parlance to a 50-year sentence, because a 50-year sentence means you're not eligible for release until you've done 25 years. So that would be my guess.
He's a good character.
I don't think the good character is going to help him.
Can I just ask members of the audience, is that, so 25 years minimum, is that figure higher or lower than what you would have expected? Show of hands who thinks that's a very high tariff. Thank you. And who thinks that's low? And who thinks it's about right? And who doesn't? Who doesn't know? Okay. No, interesting. Thank you. Yes. Yes. Which is statistically quite old for a murderer.
There's the lovely story of the High Court judge sentencing someone who was aged 60 to 30 years imprisonment, whereupon the prisoner said to the judge, as you heard again on the tape, he was entitled to express his view. He said, "I cannot do, I will not live that long." To which the judge replied, "Well, do as many as you can."
On a wider, it's interesting though. There's lots of debate about sentencing, about the public hearing judges' sentence, and then the red tops getting outraged, and judges being considered to be out of step. But time and time again, there's some research done on this. When judges and lawyers explain the reasons for sentencing, as Tony's done today, and given you reasoning, 9 times out of 10, the public agreed with the sentence. And it's just interesting seeing the response here, that the majority of you thought that the sentencing was on the guidelines, on the parameters, about right. And it's one of my little hobby horses that I get fed up sometimes when I see the red top slamming sentencing and people taking their diet of what's right and wrong from what they say. There's a lot to be said for us explaining more at times, I think, to the public why we sentence.
One of my least favourite tabloid headlines, a person convicted of, I think, manslaughter, for which he, at the tabloid, said no more than 10 years. In fact, he had life imprisonment with a minimum of 10 years. And the tabloid forgot to mention the life imprisonment side of it. Please read your tabloids with care, as a person who has suffered at their hands in my lifetime.
Ladies and gentlemen, here's what we're going to do. I promised the staff here that we were aiming to finish by 8:30. It is nearly 8:30. I just want to bring in, to sort of sum up and mention anything that we as the lawyers presenting missed out. Someone who is a lawyer, a practicing lawyer, but also a bit of a Crippen expert. So I'm just going to give Neil 5 minutes to sum up or illuminate us with anything that we didn't cover. Then we'll take one final question. We'll just show our appreciation to the people who have participated tonight, and we'll have to close. But certainly I know myself and at least one of the lawyers here will be retiring to a hostelry quite close by, so if any of you want to join us for a further discussion in a more convivial atmosphere, then I'll disclose those details. So we're into the last 5 or 10 minutes now, and I pass over to Neil.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. Perhaps I could start where Greg left off, because you may know that after a long case, and 5 days was long in 1910, it is traditional for the judge and counsel to go out for dinner. And after the Crippen case, we had a look at the records of the receipts at the Wig and Pen, and we found that between them, they managed to consume 5 bottles of sherry. And after the 5th bottle, Lord Elverstone said to the others, you know, Mrs. Crippen was present on every day of that trial. And astonished counsel said, what? And he said, yes, but she was too cut up to say anything. The other characters there present were Muir, who was prosecuting. He was one of only 2 Treasury counsel at the Old Bailey at the time, very different to most of them, not Eton, not Oxford, very unpopular with the others, no sense of humour, didn't like going out drinking, used to prepare, his motto was train hard, fight easy, so he would simply, and they called him Muir with the playing cards, because he used to have playing cards on which he wrote down all his cross-examination. So if the answer was yes, it went one way. If it was no, the other way. Very, very boring person, but far superior to counsel for Crippen, who was Tobin, who was inexperienced, not very good at crime, had the wrong approach to this sort of case. He was appointed by a solicitor called, he was instructed by a solicitor called Arthur Newton, who, as you quite rightly say, was a crook, in that he contacted Crippen when Crippen was in prison in Canada and said, I've arranged for your representation through your friends. In fact, it was arranged by a newspaper in return for exclusive copy. And when the copy was not good enough, Newton actually made up stories, including a confession between conviction and sentence. And Newton was eventually struck off as a solicitor. And Lord Justice Darling, who heard his case in the High Court, said that even the greatest criminal, such as Crippen, is entitled to be represented properly. And on this occasion, he was not properly represented by Newton, who in fact wanted to instruct Marshall Hall, who was one of the great advocates of the time, and who even in 1910, his florid Victorian style of advocacy was considered out of date. But Marshall Hall, Newton went to Marshall Hall's clerk, who did not trust him and wanted payment in advance. And Newton stormed out of Marshall Hall's chambers in Temple Gardens, went next door and instructed Tobin just in a fit of temper. And the result is that Crippen hanged by the neck until he was dead. So those are the other characters. The other characters you've heard about. Inspector Dew, one line of cross-examination which they may have considered was that Dew had been involved in the Jack the Ripper inquiry when he was working in the East End. He'd actually found the body, according to his own autobiography, he'd found the body of the Ripper's last victim. And one line of cross-examination might have been, you were disappointed there, so you've deliberately buried these remains where you knew that Crippen was away when he'd taken flight, in order to maintain your reputation. Although having said that, I think Dew was actually very fond of Crippen, because when he took his statement under caution, which you could do in those days without arresting someone, he took him out for dinner in the middle of it all. And they went to a restaurant in New Oxford Street called Frascati's, and Crippen said, Dew said, Crippen struck me as a man who had not a care in the world as he tucked into his beefsteak. And indeed, Arthur Newton's clerk, who clerked the case at the Bailey, said that looking at his client, he thought he was someone who'd received a summons for riding a bicycle without a bike. He was so relaxed. And indeed, even when they passed around the remains during the trial, in what looked like a soup bowl, Crippen simply looked professor, sort of slightly disinterested, slightly distant from those remains. The importance of that is, of course, that, as you've heard, Spilsbury, about whom I'm writing a screenplay because I find him extremely interesting, Spilsbury was instructed by the prosecution. It was his first criminal trial. And Spilsbury was so certain that this was the mark of a scar that he was very convincing the way he put across that case to the jury. He said, it is the mark of the scar and nothing less. Even though the defense said it wasn't a mark of the scar, it was a fold in the skin where the remains had been buried. Because on the scar you have no sebaceous glands and you have no hair, and the prosecution sought to prove that it was a scar for that reason. Again, unfortunately for Crippen, Newton had instructed two experts, Dr. Turnbull and Dr. Wall, both of whom looked at the remains, I think at a dinner party after a few bottles of claret as well. And Newton said to them, I don't want to call you as a witness, I just want to get your opinion. And they both said, oh, it's not a scar, it's not even from the abdomen, it's from the upper thigh. And when they'd sobered up a little bit, they realized that they were probably wrong. But Newton had tricked them and sent them witness summonses, and they were required to give evidence at the Bailey on behalf of the defence. And they were, of course, totally destroyed by cross-examination by Muir. So those are the other characters. Could I just deal, I know we haven't got very long, let me just deal briefly with some of the particular interest in this case. Firstly, wireless telegraphy. He was the first fugitive to be arrested as a result of wireless telegraphy on a ship. So I think that explains some of the interest. The other is, it's probably the first modern case where the press were deeply involved in the investigation. And indeed, it was like a 1910 Big Brother, because the chase across the Atlantic was followed by the newspapers. So they drew little plans of where Dew's steamer was and where Crippen and Reeve's steamer was. And it was an exciting chase, which the public followed. And they discussed it all over the place. It was the only talk in town at the time. The only people who did not know were Crippen and Reeve. And Crippen actually remarked to somebody on board the ship, when he saw the sparks of the wireless telegraphy, he said, how wonderful, how lucky we are to live in the modern age of technology. So little did he know he was being caught by a Marconi probe. It's also the first case, you have in your leaflets there a photograph of Crippen and Reeve. In fact, that photograph is not taken at the Bailey, that's taken at Bow Street. And those familiar with Bow Street, rest in peace, will recognise the green door and the green dock. That was taken on committal at Bow Street as a result of that photograph, which was taken by a photographer hiding his camera in his bowler hat. The prohibition on in-court photography was imposed. So there we have another example of this case, a modern, really marking the modern era, not only in relation to forensic science, but also in relation to that aspect. And I should mention one other aspect, because I know counsel for the defence has mentioned this. The hyacinth was purchased on the 19th of December by Crippen. He purchased 5 grains. Now, a lethal dose is about half a grain, or between a quarter and a half a grain. He was cross-examined about his use of it in homeopathy, and he stumbled over the question. He was asked, can you tell me one patient for whom you have prescribed hyacinth? And he said, oh, I think his name was Sweeney, or maybe Max Sweeney. And that was all. But let me just tell you this, that the current dose of hyacinth in travel sickness pills is 0.03 milligrams, which is the equivalent of 0.00 point, I don't know what, of a grain. But it's a tiny, tiny amount. So 5 grains is such a large amount that Lewis and Burroughs had never had to purchase such a large amount. And they had to send out separately for it, especially for it. So to suggest that 5 grains was to be used in homeopathy is actually impossible. He was asked when he'd used it. He said, well, he worked at the Royal Bethlehem Hospital, as they called them at that time, for the insane. And it was used in tiny, tiny doses, but for 5 grains. And in the body parts which were found, there was about 2/5 of a grain. It's certainly a fatal dose if you translate that to the body altogether. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I've got a lot more to say about the case, but I think just one more point, I think, before I leave you. And being a real lawyer, perhaps I'll say 2. Ethel Lelieve was represented by Frederick Smith, who was later Lord Birkenhead, Liberal MP at the time when the Liberals were opposed to the Conservatives. And he used to go from his chambers in the Temple to the House of Commons via the club of which I'm a member, the National Liberal Club. And the only reason he went there was to use the lavatory. And eventually the Dawn got so fed up with this, he said to Smith, excuse me, sir, you do know this is a club. And he said, oh, is it a club as well? So Smith represented Ethel Lelieve very, very well, and put the blame on Crippen, and said this poor innocent young lady who was misled by Crippen, she didn't know what was happening. But certainly there is a theory that she was responsible for the murder. Crippen took the blame because he wanted to cover up for her. There are other theories, such as you've heard, such as perhaps he was performing unlawful abortions, perhaps he Cora a dose as an anti-aphrodisiac, and it went wrong. Sometimes too much, or the wrong dose of housing, instead of leading to depression, leads to mania, and that may explain why he shot her, if he did shoot her. And there's evidence, it wasn't used in the trial, there was a neighbour in Brecknock Road who heard a shot, and it reported in the Islington Museum that she'd heard a shot on the night of 31st of January through 1st of February. So those are the other theories.
There's also evidence that wasn't used at the trial of whether it's accurate or not of Crippen being seen throwing the package into the canal.
Yeah,
which might have been considered with the head.
Certainly one of the theories is that he disposed of the head in the Regent's Canal. Genuinely, finally now, because I know it's not fair to the staff to keep them here, just finally this, J.B. Priestley, in his book on the Edwardians, described Crippen in this way. He said, I don't have any natural sympathy for a man who cuts up his wife and puts her in the cellar. But I can't help thinking it would have been so much nicer if he'd made his escape and lived happily ever after with his beloved Ethel. There must have been something to him. There must have been something to him much more than so much meat for the hangman. Thank you very much.
That we take one final question if there is one. Better be a good one.
What happened to the money?
What
happened to the money?
The money was
going to
the
withdraw.
Charing Cross Bank collapsed in 1910. They lost all their money.
Cheryl, remind me of the name of the pub where people who want to adjourn can adjourn to.
The Nag's Head.
Where's that?
It's jokes. You've got it.
The peasant. Thank you. So, ladies and gentlemen, there is an opportunity for those who want to stay a little longer and have a drink and carry on the discussion. Pub over the road. Can I thank you all for coming? I hope you found it of interest. And can I just ask you to join me in thanking Neil Corrie for summing up for us and bringing the... all in one go, and then you can clap at the end. John Cooper QC for defending so ably and on this occasion successfully. Sir Anthony Hooper for summing up and judging for us. Counsel for prosecuting the case. Mrs. Foxsmith for being the jury bailiff.
And God bless the jury.
And the staff of the museum for indulging me and allowing me to put on the presentation for you.